This will be the first of two lectures on metabolism for third year students. Let's begin. Information about the lecture. Before we get started with the main body of the lecture, I want you to focus on the following questions as you are listening to the lecture itself, and by the end, I want you to be able to answer them. Let's take a look at some of the clinically significant questions that this lecture will answer. High metabolic rates of children means that they are more prone to certain clinically significant conditions. Try to name the conditions that young children are prone to due to their high metabolic rates. Disbalance in plasma electrolyte concentrations are a serious problem that doctors of intensive care have to deal with on a daily basis. Can you name 5 major electrolytic disturbances of blood plasma? Disbalance in plasma proton concentrations, the pH, are another serious problem that doctors of intensive care have to deal with on a daily basis. Name the major pH disturbances of blood plasma and the normal range of plasma pH. Let's begin. Metabolism. Change. This is a set of life-sustaining chemical transformations within the cells of living organisms. These enzyme-driven reactions modify assimilated chemical substances from consumed food and convert them into usable substances or energy molecules. As you can see, the metabolic pathways are quite complex and warrant in-depth study. But we're going to concern ourselves with metabolism as it pertains to medical care. Metabolism is a relatively closed cycle of chemical reactions that create a special system, partially isolated from the environment. Another important concept is homeostasis. Constant internal environment is the condition for the free and independent life. Homeoresis, dynamic sustainability of vital processes, is the development and support of constancy in systems of developing children's inherent bodies. Metabolism consists of processes of assimilation, absorption of substances that enter the body, synthesis, anabolic processes. The process of dissimilation, splitting of substances that are part of living organisms, catabolic processes. As you can see, we have the catabolic pathway, the catabolism, energy yielding metabolism, and anabolic pathway, the biosynthetic metabolism. We can observe the inbound energy sources being utilized into energy, and also the byproduct of this process would be heat. And of course, we would gain also the metabolic products. The anabolism is the opposite. It's the utilization of the ATP energy and the use of external nutrients to form the intracellular precursors, intermediaries, and biopolymers. Phases of energy formulation due to metabolism. Phase 1, splitting of large molecules into smaller in the gastrointestinal tract. And you can see that we can get the 20 amino acids from proteins, right? We can get the uh, from the 3 hexoses, glucose, galactose, and fructose from the carbohydrates, and from the fats, triglycerides, glycerol, and fatty acids, of course. Phase 2, cleavage of these substances by incomplete combustion of the release of amount of 30% of energy contained in food substances. And phase 3, Phase 2 final products that are burned to water and carbon dioxide in the Krebs cycle. That releases the other 60 to 70% of energy. Let's look at the energy consumption. How does the body consume energy, especially in terms of children? We have the basal metabolism, the support of our own body's body temperature, and various other processes. The growth. Yes, every child is in a state of constant growth. Muscle activity, digestion and absorption of food, energy costs, which are difficult to take into account. Factors that determine the characteristics and energy metabolism in children. The specific need for plastic materials caused an increase in body weight and organ development. Changing the number of metabolic pathways and cycles at different stages of growth define gene control. Sustainable development of neuroendocrine regulation of metabolism and age-related changes in tissue sensitivity to the action of hormones. Change periods of growth and differentiation of tissues. Changes in the proportions of internal organs and muscles in relations to the body weight. Increase body's energy reserves during growth. The relative reduction in volume of internal environment. Basically, this leads to the increasing of cell mass. Peculiarities of children's chemical and energy metabolism. The child's body, in the growing relationship between processes of assimilation and dissimilation, gradually changes. Children dominate the process of synthesis, assimilation, over the process of decay. In adults, the rate of these processes are aligned, as in symmetrical. For children, a high intensity of exchange is characteristic. High activity of energy metabolism, lability of exchange, sensitivity to metabolic actions of various adverse factors. Please note, because of the high metabolic rates of children, they are more prone to hypoglycemia, acetonemia, and in case of diabetes mellitus, fast development of ketoacidosis. Water-ion metabolism. Water and dissolved salts in a cell and outside the cell, called the water-salt metabolism. Electrolytes that are responsible for the mineralization of the skeleton: calcium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfates, mineral metabolism. As well as you can see the macroelectrolytes present and the microelectrolytes that are present. The total body water content versus age. Here you can clearly see that the younger the child is, the higher is the percent of water as a part of his total body mass. And as the child grows older, his body mass becomes less and less dependent on the water content, which clinically results in the fact that smaller children have a high risk of becoming dehydrated much faster than older children or adults. Distribution of water versus age. We have extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid. As you can clearly see, newborn children have a very high concentration of extracellular fluid, while intracellular fluid remains smaller. Children of 1 year and adults have a fairly same amount of intracellular fluid, but the extracellular fluid is still different. Small children having more than adults. The amount of mineral elements. From this chart, you can look in details as to the normal amounts of such components as sodium, potassium, versus the age of the child. Fluoride and calcium do not significantly depend on age, and we can have a one set of normals. Phosphorus and iron also have a dependence on the age as to the amount of normal concentrations. This is obviously just examples, and they're provided in millimoles per liter. Let's look at the clinical significance of these electrolytic disturbances. Clinical signs of hyperkalemia, which is a blood potassium excess. It changes the excitability of tissues, decreases the ratio between intracellular and extracellular potassium. Some of the main manifestations can be observed on the ECG. An early sign of exacerbation T wave. Next, we have flattening of the P wave, lengthening of the interval of PQ or the PR interval, expression of the complex QRS, it becomes wider, so wide QRS complex, and finally, a flatline ECG with cardiac arrest, asystole. Neurological symptoms: tingling, paresthesia, weakness, and flaccid paralysis. Clearly examine the main aspects of the ECG with hyperkalemia. And let's move on. Clinically, we have hyperkalemia manifesting as muscles twitching, cramping, and paresthesia, mentioned previously, but also irritability and anxiety, decrease in blood pressure, changes on the ECG that you have already seen, dysrhythmias, irregular rhythm, abdominal cramping, and diarrhea. Clinical signs of hypokalemia, blood potassium deficit, muscle weakness and paresis, which may result in hypoventilation and apnoea, constipation and intestinal obstruction, increased likelihood of cardiac arrhythmias, ventricular ectopic rhythm, and fibrillations. On the ECG, we see the appearance of U wave. You can clearly see it. It follows the T wave, which is shallow, but the prominent one on this ECG of hypokalemia will be the U wave, as well as slightly peaked P wave, slightly prolonged PR interval, and an ST depression. Furthermore, we have a reduction in the ability of the kidneys to concentrate urine. This leads to polyuria and rhabdomyolysis. Here's another presentation, clinical, of what we will see with decreased potassium: alkalosis, shallow respirations, irritability, confusion, drowsiness, weakness, fatigue, arrhythmias, irregular rate, tachycardia, lethargy, ready pulse, as well as decreased intestinal motility, nausea, vomiting, and ileus. Here's a comparison on the ECG between an ECG showing a normal amount of potassium, decreased amount of potassium, and increased amount of potassium. And let's move on. Clinical and physiological effects of hyponatremia, blood sodium deficit. The symptoms: gastrointestinal disorders such as anorexia, nausea, vomiting, cell hyperhydration, especially in the brain, the lungs, osmotic swelling, changes in the mental status, including things such as headaches, irritability, disorientation, and confusion, and finally leading to convulsions, coma, and death. Here you can see the swelling of the erythrocytes, the osmotic swelling of erythrocytes, where the water moves into the erythrocyte cells. And here's another cartoon representing hyponatremia. Signs and symptoms of lethargy, headache, confusion, apprehension, seizures, and coma. And here you can see at the bottom what type of symptomology, what type of symptoms that the patient may have that will lead to the appearance of hyponatremia. So things like vomiting and diarrhea, use of diuretics, etc. Now let's look at the clinical and physiological effects of hypernatremia, blood sodium excess. Hypernatremia is almost always associated with hypertonia, increased blood pressure. For osmotic gradient of water out of the cells, the brain adapts to the loss of water by reducing cellular volume. Then, through the accumulation of osmotically active substances, betaine, inositol glyceryl phosphoryl chlorine. Symptoms include polyuria. Initial neurological symptoms include muscle weakness, lethargy, and twitching, and this is followed by convulsions and coma. Here on the picture, you can see the appearance of misshaped erythrocytes as they're losing water. This is called poikilocytosis. And here's the cartoon explaining hypernatremia. Let's move on. Blood sodium imbalance. Here's the comparison of the erythrocytes as they're looking in hypertonic, isotonic, and hypotonic situations. The shriveling, poikilocytosis, versus swelling and hemolysis. Clinical signs of hypocalcemia, blood calcium deficit, increased neuromuscular excitability, cramps, intestinal colic, diplopia, stridor, dyspnoea, and on the ECG, QT interval elongation, and the prolongation of the ST. And in the cartoon, we can also see some of the typical signs of decreased blood calcium level, such as the Chvostek sign and the Trousseau sign. Replacement of calcium by IV and replacement of calcium by nutrition together with vitamin D to help facilitate its absorption in the intestine. Next, move on to the pH disbalance, indicators of balance of acids and bases. What do we have? The value of active reaction solution of blood. The normal pH range is between 735 and 745. PCO2, partial pressure of the carbon dioxide, 35 to 45. True blood bicarbonates. We also have the standard bicarbonates, total basics of buffer systems, and excess or deficiency of bases. These are the indicators of balance of acid and bases in the blood. Average indexes of acid-base balance depending on age. So in children, starting with the late neonatal period and all throughout infancy, we have the average pH ranging at about 742, and the parameters of the other indexes of the acid-base parameters of blood. This slightly changes in the ages between 1 and 3, and again, we have some decrease in the ages later on. These are the mechanisms by which the body responds to changes of electrolyte, um, changes of the pH balance in the blood. If the pH of the blood becomes more acidic, this is referred to as acidosis, and the body will respond by the first pathway, pathway A, by increasing respiratory rate, um, by the increased respiratory rate, which will appear, will have to be decreased in order to produce more CO2. And of course, the other major organ that's going to have to correct its the blood pH disturbance are the kidneys. The kidneys will correct the blood disturbance by excreting more protons with the urine and thereby generating more bicarbonate to go into the blood. If the blood pH becomes more basic, this will be called alkalosis, and your body will respond to alkalosis by having the decreased respiratory rate elevated to reduce the amount of CO2, while the kidneys will secrete bicarbonates with the urine while generating more protons for the blood. That's all for this part of the lecture. Thank you.